Hi everyone, welcome to today's session on the Flex 236. We're running a webinar on this particular document, which is all about enabling the development of inclusive standards and understanding the role of data and data analysis within the standards making process. It's great to be with you here today. My name is Sanya Hack. I am the technical author for the Flex, and more broadly, I'm a specialist in diverse audiences. So I do a lot of work within research and data and using that to support development, such as through amplifying the voices of lesser heard groups, something I'm very passionate about and I've worked in for over a decade now. I also work a lot in different sectors such as music and entertainment and using, again, data to help push the diversity agenda and increase equality in those spaces. Having worked in the market and social research space for over a decade, recently I decided to set up my own brand, which is Bite Stereotypes, which brings together a lot more of my work in training and strategy. And also that has led me to work on this particular Flex. So in today's session, we'll be looking at the Flex in detail. We'll look at the importance of inclusive data, particularly in today's digital age. And then we'll deep dive into the Flex itself, which is broken out into three broad areas. So let's just go through the agenda point by point, and then I'll also explain those three areas. So firstly, standards and what is their role? Why do we need inclusive data? What's the importance of data in standards development? We'll then look at an overview of the aims, objectives, and uses of the Flex 236 version 2, its scope, key terms and data laws to be aware of, and then the steps, like I mentioned. So we break down the standards making process into three steps, the first being identifying the need for and scope of inclusive data within standards. Step 2 is then selecting that data and analyzing that data with inclusivity in mind. And then the third step is maintaining that inclusivity over time to ensure that the standard remains relevant and is fulfilling the objectives of inclusivity. So firstly then, why do standards matter? So as many of you I'm sure are aware and passionate about, standards are essential to individuals, industries, and societies. They provide a framework for consistency, quality, safety, and innovation, therefore contributing significantly to individual well-being, the efficiency of industries, and also the global economy more broadly. So standards are at the forefront of decision-making in products and services, in processes, in management systems, and industries. And standards such as the BSIs are often globally recognized international benchmarks, which can therefore provide a guide for people working across the globe, which the Flex is one such document. There are also different types of standards, as many of you will know. So in particular, we've got the PAS versus the Flex. So these are two different standards that differ in terms of the development time, the versioning, and the feedback required. So if we look at each in detail, so the PAS, which is a publicly available specification, is a preferred choice for industries that are relatively stable in terms of the environment, and they're not expected to, experience rapid change or growth in a particular time period. So these generally take between 8 and 13 months to produce. The development phase includes about 1 month of public consultation, and there generally tends to be a single version. The Flex, on the other hand, is for industries that are experiencing rapid changes, and therefore adaptability and flexibility are key. The production is a lot shorter, so the turnaround time is about 3 months for the development. The methodology involves an extended period of public consultation to gather feedback from a broad range of stakeholders to help improve the guidance of the document, and it's also highly iterative. So there's generally a minimum of 2 versions, and this can be increased to a third if it felt that that would benefit, which is the case with this current Flex. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of why this in inclusive data was a flex, but also to add to that, you may be aware that there's a lot going on right now in terms of artificial intelligence and its governance and what it means for industries. Here in the UK, which is where I'm based, we recently held the AI Safety Summit, which was brought together a lot of leaders and researchers in the space and experts to try to understand the implications of AI for safety, what it means for industries, how do we govern it, etc. And this document that we've produced is also part of that narrative. Okay, so first things first, this flex is about inclusive standards. Ensuring that data and analysis help to inform that. But what is inclusivity? So here are a couple of definitions that we'll look at. So the first one is from the United Nations Disability Inclusive Language Guidelines, which I really, really like. It breaks it down, and this diagram is also from there, and we'll come to look at that shortly. So there is a substantial difference between integration and inclusion. Integration is the process of making a person adapt to or fit into society, whereas inclusion refers to the process of changing society to include every individual. Then from the Cambridge Dictionary, inclusivity is the idea that everyone should be able to use the same facilities, take part in the same activities, and enjoy the same experiences, including people who have a disability or other disadvantage. So if we look at this diagram, we see here that exclusion on the top left is where you've obviously got the main group of people, and then you have others that are very much kept outside of that core group. Then we have segregation, which is the core group, and people, again, outside, but very much kept within a certain bubble, I suppose, or kept away. Integration is having everyone within the same area, but again, a designated space for people that aren't necessarily part of the majority group and they have to adapt to get in. Whereas inclusion is everyone's included in the same space as they are, and that's the priority and the focus. Okay, moving on then to the importance of data. Like I mentioned, my whole career has very much been focused on data and using that and research to help create inclusivity, to help people better understand diverse groups, to give voice to their needs. And because I thought that it could just very much, be a core part of that by empowering communities. So broadly, data is really important to decision making in society because it helps us understand the experiences and needs of different groups. That information then helps to inform policies and services that aim to create a fairer society where everybody has the opportunity to flourish. The career that I've spent most of my life in, which is market and social research, this is very much core and fundamental to what we do. It's about representing voices of different communities and giving them a voice to power, whether it's to governments and NGOs or whether it's to industries and decision makers there. So when done right, and often it isn't done right, which is what we'll look at, and it can make things worse, but when done right, data offers critical benefits to lesser heard groups because it does provide that evidence for decision making that otherwise may not be there, which could lead to costly missteps, errors, or decisions being made which are actually not effective and they're not meeting people's needs, again, which is at the heart of what we're doing here. Like I mentioned, it offers a platform for people to be able to represent their own stories. And that's really important. That plus having, holistic insight because groups are not, there are very many differences within a lot of diverse communities. They are inherently diverse in themselves. And often that narrative, though, is driven generally by particular subgroups. That might be because they're the ones that we know most about or are a focal point or are perhaps the loudest. But also the narrative could be driven by third parties who have a specific agenda or again have a leaning towards one group or the other. This can sadly lead to the perpetuation of restrictive and often harmful stereotypes. And we are trying to combat that then through data, or through inclusive data. So as mentioned, data is critical to industries and how societies function, and it's becoming even more important in today's world because it's at the heart of technological and societal developments. So let's look first at what data is defined as. So in this flex, we refer to or define data as the following: reinterpretable representation of information in a formalized manner suitable for communication, interpretation, or processing. Now, that's a lot of words, and it is actually a very accurate representation. But if we break it down a little bit and sort of make that easier, so data can be in various different formats. So it could be analog, so written down, for example. It could be digitally collected. It could be numerical, so numbers. It could be textual, so written information, or it could be imagery, or it could be sounds. And what we'll look at here as well is we come with data. Our viewpoints of people, our lived experiences, those are also data, and we'll come on to that shortly, but it's everything. It's everywhere. It's not just in digital technologies. But that said, it is even more important, like we said, because it is fueling things that are changing society and the way we live on a day-to-day basis. So AI, robotics, machine learning, it's at the core of that, which is why we need to make sure that data is inclusive because it has knock-on effects, which we'll come on to discuss. As I mentioned, it's embedded in the digital economy. It's at the heart of decision-making for businesses, organizations, and governments. And the velocity and scale that data is currently at affects individuals in their day-to-day lives. So it's part of, for example, algorithms that shape service experiences or things like your streaming platforms, and people are increasingly becoming interested in data and using that as well. So it doesn't feel as scary as maybe it once was for consumers and day-to-day people, but they are open to then using it. But it does then make it even more important that we are mindful of any biases and ensuring that people actually have a fair opportunity to benefit also from data. So coming on to understanding bias. Now, what's critical to understand is that all data have context. It is not neutral. It's not objective. The context of data is the why, when, and how data were collected. And this context gives data both its meaning and its purpose, but can also introduce bias. Now, I want to flag that none of us are without bias. We all have bias, be it conscious or unconscious, and that could be positive biases towards things or negative biases towards things or groups. It's often just a result of having exposure or not having exposure to something. So, but by being aware of our biases, we can minimize the negative effects they have on our day-to-day lives, work, in this case, in the standards that we're creating. Now, the level of bias in data is influenced by a range of different things. Again, we are going to keep coming back to this, but it's influenced by how data are collected, processed, and interpreted by individuals or indeed machines that are trained by individuals. We look at two types of bias in the flex. Social bias, broadly two areas. So social bias, which is the tendency, inclination, or opinion that is preconceived or unreasoned that hinders impartial judgment. Now, I do want to flag here that, like I mentioned, this could be positive bias. You could just really like, I don't know, just very much like something and not really have much data behind that. But that's also a positive bias. Like I said, there's also negative bias. So it's important to be aware of both factors because positive bias isn't necessarily a good thing. Because again, you could be, something could have an unfairly positive benefit on one group while actually negatively impacting others, and we may not have thought about that. Then there's technical bias, which is deviation from the truth in the collection, analysis, interpretation, and publication of data, and that can lead to false conclusions or it being used wrongly. So those are two broad biases that we should be aware of. So building on this, data bias and the exclusion it introduces at scale does have dangerous consequences for the entire population. We must be mindful of how these biases influence the representativeness of data, how it's incorporated into new technologies, and its consequent impact on industries and society. So looking at a few specific areas, so bias in sampling can occur when you're looking at relatively homogeneous groups or samples and you're lacking sufficient data on diverse audiences, be it across age, ethnicity, region, education, sexual orientation, etc. You've perhaps not included that within the sample, and it's a very specific subset of a population. Like I mentioned, groups are not monolithic. So even if you're looking at a diverse group, but you don't have a large enough sample to capture and robustly analyze those variations, it's still a relatively homogeneous and biased sample. So you want to be aware of all of that. Artificial intelligence is very much based off of certain data, and that data becomes the reality for the AI, for the model. And if that data is skewed, like this keeps saying, those biases are then going to be replicated at scale within society. We see that in industries, it can lead to negative consequences, such as differing outcomes for people in terms of university allocations, credit scoring, and medical technologies. So who is this Flex for? So the Flex 236 is for a broad range of stakeholders, those developing standards, but also those wanting to inform policies, procedures, and regulations in inclusive data. And it is important to note that this is a guide, so it has got a broader remit. It looks at helping organizations or individuals build their capabilities and confidence around inclusive data, helps them understand the limitations of data in terms of its inclusivity, helps them understand the risks of data not being inclusive and how to minimize these. The Flex is aligned with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, specifically those around gender equality and racial inequalities. And therefore, by using this, so essentially data then plays an important part in, like I said, empowering women and girls, and also in giving voice or helping us understand marginalized communities and ensure that the benefits of development are evenly distributed across all groups. By implementing this Flex and aligning with it, organizations and individuals can therefore also help to support the SDGs. Okay, so the scope of the Flex in a little bit more detail and how inclusive data is incorporated within it. So we're going to look specifically, and we'll come on to all of these, at how data is selected, assessed, and used in the standards development process. We'll look at how to deal with gaps or limitations in the existing data that you have for a Flex that's for a document, for a standard that's already there or one that you're developing, because you won't have perfect data sets. So it is important to just be mindful of how to handle that. Looks at human bias in depth, looks at the ways data are interpreted and incorporated into decision making, looks at how bias can be included in data and its impact of how actually could lead to then other groups being excluded from different products and services. And we also look at communities affected and how to identify who those might be and how to mitigate that. What it doesn't cover is specific aspects of product or service design or data privacy and security. Okay, so ensuring that standards are based on data that's inclusive, because otherwise we can end up perpetuating historic inequities. But as standards makers, there's an opportunity to revisit certain standards or certain products and services that might be out there and actually make them more inclusive by incorporating inclusive data. Like I mentioned, the standard has three broad areas. This is to ensure that inclusivity is then embedded within every aspect of standards development. So just revisiting these, First being to identify the need for and scope of standards. So this will look at how to consider including diverse stakeholders within the development process and in the feedback process, and how we can go about looking at the audiences that are positively or negatively affected by the standard. We'll look at how data are selected and analyzed, ensuring that they are inclusive, de-biased, diverse in perspective also. And then we'll look at how to maintain the inclusivity of standards in terms of the data that are used, so analysis of processes and quality procedures as well. So some key terms that are used within this are the following. So we've got a range of different ones that can be incorporated that are in the Flex. So we'll read through these. So data governance, which is the process focusing on managing the quality, consistency, usability, security, and availability of information. Discrimination, which is defined as unjust or, I can never say this, prejudicial treatment of different categories of people. Diversity, referring to characteristics of difference or similarities between people. Equality is the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, opportunities, and outcomes. Fairness refers to principles that everyone is subject to procedures that are equitable and, as far as possible, free from systemic bias or systematic bias. Harm refers to negative impacts to people, communities, or environments. Historically marginalized groups. Now, this will differ in different countries and contexts, but essentially this is about communities, ethnicities, races, or social categories that have experienced systematic discrimination, exclusion, or unequal treatment over a significant period of time. Again, it's important for the context that you're in to understand who those groups might be and identify them within your stakeholders that may be at risk of harm from a standard or industry. Intersectionality refers to the interconnected nature of social categories. So the concept here is that individuals may experience overlapping systems of discrimination or privilege based on various aspects of their identity, so race, gender, class, etc. And then the standards maker refers to individuals or groups that are taking part in the development of a standard. So, standards makers need to navigate the landscape of global, regional, and national data regulations to ensure that they handle data with responsibility and legally. Now, this will differ depending on where you are, but we'll use some UK and EU examples, which are very prominent here. So the Equality Act. The Equality Act of 2010 is particularly important in that it safeguards individuals across 9 protected characteristics, and it's designed to promote equality and prevent discrimination in day-to-day life. These are across a broad range of factors. So this is discrimination across life in general, employment specifically, education, housing, goods and services, and critically, it grants people legal protection against discrimination. So they can take legal action if they feel that they are being discriminated against in a particular area. So again, something that we need to be more and more mindful of as we're looking to design and create more inclusive societies. The 9 characteristics here in the UK are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion and belief, sex, and sexual orientation. Again, the characteristics may differ in your context, but this particular act, and there are other ones, are also perhaps something you may be aware of, or you may have something similar. Then we have the General Data Protection Regulation, EU GDPR, which again, like I said, even if it's not used, may inform regional and other laws. So GDPR demands heightened care when collecting, handling, and storing data particularly data that could be considered sensitive or special category data. This very much aligns with the characteristics that are covered in the Equality Act here in the UK, particularly around things like race, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, etc. These are all characterized as special category sensitive data, and individuals have the right to be informed about how their data is collected and used. They can access the personal data held on them. They can rectify inaccuracies or incomplete information on them. They can restrict or object to their data being used, and they can also lodge complaints. So again, like I've been saying, it's important to note that consumers and public can raise concerns and seek legal action if they feel products and services are discriminatory. Standards makers then can help to prevent this and alleviate concerns by ensuring that what we're doing is inclusive from the start. Right, so on to our steps. Step 1 being identifying the need for and scope of inclusive data within standards. Here we'll look at ensuring that we include diverse stakeholders in the process and that we're aware of who the standard might impact. So firstly, understanding the target audience and having an inclusive approach to doing that. So whether you're creating a new standard or you're reviewing an existing one, it's important to understand who could be impacted. Of course, you want to think about, yes, who might be positively impacted, perhaps some that might be positively impacted in maybe a disproportionate way. But what's critical is that we avoid harm. So without inclusive data, some people may be overlooked or left behind. And it's important that we evaluate the potential impact of this and that we account for, as far as we can, every community that could be negatively impacted. Now, that is, of course, a big task, which is why it's important to have different viewpoints, but it is critical that we take as broad an outlook as possible. And sadly, we are seeing many examples of this, which, does give us information on, oh, okay, wait, let's consider this group or let's consider these impacts. So some of these examples include racial bias in AI-driven recruitment. We're seeing that those sorts of recruitment practices are actually making it even harder for diverse candidates, for example, from Black backgrounds, to get through certain stages of the recruitment process. And when we already know that there are systemic barriers to people getting into certain industries, AI is just seeking to reinforce that and sadly make it worse. Then safety risks for women drivers. We've seen there's lots of data that shows that a lot of the testing of safety equipment in cars is done on male bodies, and women were sadly more likely to die in accidents because the seatbelt was not protecting them. Also seeing different, service effectiveness across ethnic groups, such as facial recognition not working on certain skin types, certain ethnic communities. Next then, as discussed, we all have some form of bias, conscious or not conscious. Therefore, it's important to understand that standards makers could bring that potential bias with them into the process. More specifically, it could influence how they interpret, and their perspectives how they interpret data and what's needed, and how those perspectives can help us either become more inclusive or actually introduce further bias. So to mitigate this, when developing standards, ensure that you have a diverse range of perspectives involved. As mentioned, you might think, oh, okay, well, we'll get one person from this group or representing a certain race or ethnicity or region, whatever it might be. But remember that they come with their own perspectives and they might have very specific lived experiences of one part of the community, but not others. So do try and make sure you've got a broad range. It should not be about ticking boxes. It should be about actually understanding limitations of everyone's viewpoints and then being like, can you broaden them out, or are they able to gather more information? So it's important to be inclusive, but just know that just having one person may not be enough. This can be supported by encouraging a broad range of stakeholders to offer feedback. So then you can therefore gain views from more people. and it helps you get to a better understanding, a better sort of consensus of the community overall. So the extended, like we said, consultation period for comments is very, very critical for this, and ensuring that that group itself is diverse. So then we'll now look at the second step, which is about how to select and analyze the data used in standards making. How do we ensure that it's inclusive, debiased, and diverse in perspective also? There are a few things to cover in this section, but we'll start by looking at the types of data that can be included in the standards development process. So this could be provided data. There could be information that is supplied or given from an external source, third-party vendor, or other secondary information that might be publicly available. We have observed data. So this is information that's gathered through direct observational measurements. So it could be ethnographic research. It's important to note that particularly when it comes to sensitive information, making incorrect assumptions or observations is actually risky because GDPR kind of regulates against that. So for example, if you're looking at a certain community and you just make an assumption about someone's religion or their gender or whatever it might be, actually that is seen as harmful. And so people could take action against that. So you do want to be careful when you're looking or using observed data for diverse populations. Let's look at a couple of others. We've got proxy data. So that's data that's substituted, so or indirect data that isn't necessarily that data point. And that can be particularly tricky again for diverse populations because you might anyway have a lack of data, lack of good quality data for that group. It may not be captured. That's often the case in primary data. We don't have enough of it when it comes to diverse audiences. But using proxy data on a group that you don't anyway, perhaps have robust information on is even riskier. So you want to be mindful. We've got synthetic data, which is artificially generated data that mimics the real world and is used for machine learning models. Again, if that information is not there so much on diverse communities, you're again training the model on biased data, which is very much exclusionary. Secondary data is information that's collected from sources other than the individual user, and you could repurpose different data or information out there. And then primary data, which I'm always a big fan of and very much advocate, having worked in it for a long time, but that is collecting information directly from individuals, generally using methods such as surveys, interviews, or experiments. Now, it's great if there is budget and there's time to incorporate this into standards development. There may not be, in which case you could use available sources that have already captured some of this information, but where you can, and if it's possible, and particularly where it doesn't exist, it's useful to try to capture some primary data. Okay, so the data then and the purpose of that data should be reviewed to understand, how is it being incorporated into the standards development process. So some broad overarching questions that you want to ask yourself are things like, if the data is already incorporated into the standard, you could ask, what sort of data was used for the initial standard? How inclusive is that data? Is there additional data now since the standard's been development that could be incorporated in to improve it? How inclusive is this in additional data? And like I mentioned, does more data need to be either commissioned or gathered? And is this primary or secondary data? So it's basically taking stock of the data available to you and understanding its opportunities and limitations. It's also important to consider different factors that could introduce bias within data. So like we mentioned, there's obviously the interpretation, but there are fundamental things as well. So the interpretation being behavioral biases, so how we analyze and interpret that data, but there are also things like funding. Who's funded that data and what purpose was it for? I mentioned, is it for a certain agenda? Will that then have inherent biases in the way the data was collected, what data was collected? Historical information, how old is that data? Is it still relevant? Do we need to update it? How was it measured? What was measured? All of this very much impacts validity and the quality of data. We've got how representative is it and how is that reflected in the sampling? And it's also important to understand self-selection bias. Now, when we're often going out to diverse communities, and it's difficult perhaps to access because they're not easily accessible by traditional methods, or perhaps it's not in the public domain, sometimes there is this self-selection thing because the people that might respond to, let's say, a survey on social media, it's generally in any population, but more so here as well, we need to be aware that it's those vocal minorities sometimes, those who have a lot to say positively or those that have a lot to say negatively. So those are perhaps the, on the fringes percentage-wise, so you're not actually hearing from the majority population. So be mindful of that as well. Who is included in this and who's chosen not to take part, and how can you access them in another way? So then, given that the data, like I keep reinforcing, can lead to social and ethical problems, inequalities, etc., it's important that we take steps to document what we've done, the data we've collected, why we've collected it, and its likely impact. So questions that we could ask and you should document are the sources used and why. Why available data or other available data or competing data were not used. So showing that you're aware of the other things out there, but you've actually just decided to select something, but you need to be able to defend that. Who the data are collected from, how the data are collected, and if the data are to be updated, or was this a one-time data collection activity? Along with broadly considering these factors, there are also a range of different things that we can do. So different governance practices that we can undertake in order to document this. So along with a general impact assessment, understanding the impact of the standard as a whole, things that you can do are a data provenance assessment, an equality impact assessment. There's an assessment of the groups experiencing positive consequences from the standard, and also those that are expecting negative, potentially could be impacted negatively. There's an algorithmic impact assessment that you can do to understand the impact on algorithms that may be using this. It'd be good to do some real world testing to ensure that outcomes are equal, and then data quality impact assessments as well. Now, as I mentioned, this is a guide, and so you don't have to do absolutely everything. You would do the things that are relevant for your area of work or perhaps where you're based, and all of this information you can look in more depth in the actual document itself if you wanted to, and you will also receive these materials. Finally then, moving on to our third step, which is about maintaining the inclusivity of data and standards. So how do we ensure that the analysis approaches going forward are inclusive and that we're taking quality measures? Firstly, in terms of general data governance, so to ensure that we've, got quality data and that's how we are approaching this, there are a range of different things that should be implemented and questions that should be asked. This process should be repeated. So these questions should be asked over and over again throughout the standard development process and while it's live. So questions to ask are, have there been any changes in circumstances that could affect the standard's initial understanding of inclusivity and fairness? How can we then adjust the standard accordingly? Are there any unanticipated threats or harms that have emerged since the standard's use, and how can this be mitigated? If the standard is being used in the context of technology or machines or different mechanisms or automated processes, how do we ensure that there's sufficient human insight or a human oversight, to make sure that it's being used in an inclusive way? How can people raise concerns about the standard, particularly those affected by it? Do technical specialists have the opportunity to challenge the standard and ask for improvements? And what actions are there that can be taken if it seems that the standard is no longer inclusive. So again, some specific things that you can do. You may have a data, well, it's recommended to have a data governance plan in place, particularly things around GDPR, or whatever else it might be relevant to your area. But data quality management is one core component of this, so understanding that and reflecting on it. You could do a data protection impact assessment. Transparency is very much key to the process. So if there are groups that the standard could, unfairly impact, it's important to be transparent about this and communicate that and what's being done to mitigate it. So this helps build trust among communities and an awareness, and that you're iterating on it and there are these potential harms. This is what we're doing. And importantly, accountability. So establish things like ethics committees that can then be there to help stress test the standard and ensure that things are being looked at properly from an inclusivity point of view. That brings us to the end of this session. And as a summary, we've looked at a range of different things around the importance of data and standards in the inclusivity space. We've looked at why, even more so today, that we need inclusive data in the standards development process and in industries and society itself. We've looked at the aims, objectives, and uses of the Flex 236 version 2, looked at its scope, key terms and data laws, and then the steps within the standard making process that can help to ensure that inclusivity is embedded within it. As I mentioned, this session recording, along with its materials, will be shared with you, so you can refer back to them. You can also access the source document should you want to look at it in more depth and read through the specific actions or procedures, and then understand which ones are relevant for you and the work that you're doing. But that just remains to say thank you so much for your time today. I hope it was useful and that this helps to inform your work going forward.